Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everyone is doing well. Today I'm going to be reading you 4 true ghost stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. The Lady in Red, Toronto, Ontario. Toronto's subway system has 2 Bay Street stations, the one thousands of riders walk through every day, and another one below it that is closed to the public. Lower Bay, as it's known, was opened back in 1966 to help link the new east-west Bloor Danforth to the existing north-south Yonge Street line. But after just 6 months, the Toronto Transit Commission decided it was better to keep the 2 lines separate, because then a train broke down on either line, the entire system ground to a halt. So the stairs connecting the upper and lower Bay stations were blocked off, and the white-tiled lower station became a storage site for escalator parts and some maintenance equipment. These days, Lower Bay is often used by television and film crews shooting subway scenes. It's still used for storage too, and for testing new system signs and experimenting with possible changes to subway platforms. But a few TTC employees don't like being asked to spend time down there, especially not at night, because they don't want to meet up with the station's ghost. The spectral Lady in Red drifts through the tunnel toward the station, occasionally moaning pitifully as she approaches. Wavy brown hair frames her face and falls across her shoulders of her long red dress. The apparition lasts just 20 to 30 seconds, but that's more than enough time for a frightened observer to see the dark hollows where her eyes should be. Even more disturbing is how she moves. She seems to have no legs, appearing to float just above the ground. Is this Lady in Red the ghost of a victim of some terrible crime on the station platform, or of a tragic accident on the tracks below? No one knows. But it's easy to understand why a worker, seeing her late at night, wouldn't look forward to the possibility of encountering her ever again. Spirit Walk, Toronto, Ontario. During the 1990s, another Toronto location was a very popular choice for film and television producers, especially those who were trying to recreate scenes from the 19th century. The area known as the Distillery District lies near Lake Ontario, just east of Toronto's downtown core. It features most of the fine examples of brick and stone industrial buildings erected in the early to mid-1800s, and has been designated a National Historic Site. In the early 2000s, major restoration and renovations transformed the property into a contained, no cars allowed, village-like setting for boutiques, cafes, restaurants, and art galleries. The new and improved Distillery District welcomed the public in 2003. However, when it was used as a film set, and during its most recent transformation, ghostly goings-on at this place left some people feeling a little uncomfortable. Items moved mysteriously from one place to another, doors opened and shut on their own, and strange sounds echoed from vacant nooks and crannies. One member of a television crew even reported seeing the specter of a middle-aged man pass right through the closed door. But some people say such unnerving incidents are nothing new, and that rumors of the Distillery District being haunted date much further back to 1834. That was 2 years after James Warts, the original owner, built the first mill to grind grain on the site. Warts immigrated from England in 1831. The next year, his brother-in-law, William Gooderham, joined him in Toronto and became his business partner. In time, Warts' eldest son and Gooderham would go on to expand the milling business and built a distillery to process grain into whiskey. Unfortunately, Warts himself never lived to see the Gooderham and Warts Distillery Company become one of the most successful businesses in Toronto's history. In 1834, his world was shattered when his beloved wife died during childbirth. 12 days later, his body was found in a deep well on the property. No one knows for sure, but talk of the time suggests he was so depressed after his wife's death that he deliberately threw himself into the well. But whether it was suicide or an accident, Wort's tragic end seems to have marked the beginning of a series of eerie occurrences, leading to the belief that the Distillery District buildings are haunted by the ghost of James Worts himself. But why would his ghost wander around the place? Does he have some unfinished business to attend to where he built the mill so long ago? Or is he still lingering near where he died, hoping to connect to the spirit of his beloved wife so they can be reunited in death? Fright Night, Victoria, British Columbia. The two Australian women camped out in the sprawling gardens of a vacant old mansion in Victoria in the early 1960s, felt quite comfortable as they settled down for the night. They were experienced world travelers who didn't take foolish risks, and they had chosen their campsite with safety in mind. It couldn't be seen from the street, and nobody else was hanging around the place. Besides, the price was right. It was free. And the view from the back end of the property, a rippling, moonlit tidal inlet known as the Gorge Waterway, was breathtaking. So they were totally unprepared for what happened a few hours after they fell asleep. The shouting woke them both at the same time. Startled, they looked around in the shadows. They thought they could make out the dark figure of a small woman who kept shrieking at them to get out. They jumped up and started packing up their kits, anxious to move on, but suddenly the shouting stopped and they were alone again. Feeling confused and a little foolish, they took a few deep breaths to calm down, and then decided to stay where they were and try to get some more sleep. But neither of them got any more rest that night. As soon as they slipped back into their sleeping bags, the women were overcome by a sense of some invisible presence. A presence seething with hate because they were still there. They were exhausted and didn't want to move if they didn't have to, but the feeling of resentment became so unbearable that they finally packed up their belongings and nervously waited for dawn on the nearby bridge across the gorge. And as if they hadn't already been frightened enough that night, while sitting on the bridge, their eyes became riveted on a mysterious red light that hovered in midair, moving back and forth just above the water below. When a woman named Inez O'Reilly heard about the Australians' harrowing experience a few years later, she wasn't the least bit surprised. Learning where it had happened, she had no doubt that the woman had a run-in with her husband's grandmother, Caroline O'Reilly. Caroline would never have approved of the female travelers' unladylike behavior. Ladies in her day wouldn't have dressed casually and would never have camped out on their own under the stars. But Caroline's day was long gone. Nearly 100 years earlier, in 1867, she and her husband, Peter O'Reilly, had moved into their new home on Pleasant Street, a 15-room mansion known as Point Ellis House. The garden of the house was the very place the Australian women had chosen for their campsite. By then, Caroline had been dead for more than 60 years. Inez O'Reilly and her husband John moved into Point Ellis House soon after they married in 1965, and almost immediately, Inez felt Caroline's presence in the place. The mansion had been neglected for a long time, and Inez and John felt compelled to restore it to its original grandeur. After 2 years of expensive and time-consuming effort, they opened Point Ellis House to the public. But some visitors got to see more than the beautifully restored rooms and furnishings. They got to see Grandmother Caroline, too. One child touring the house with her own grandmother left screaming because of her ghostly presence. Some people felt an invisible hand tap them on the shoulder, and one group on tour apparently spent nearly an hour with Caroline's daughter, Kathleen. That happened on a day when Inez was so busy outdoors that she forgot about the group waiting to be shown around. When she finally realized her mistake, she rushed back into the house, embarrassed and eager to apologize, but to her surprise, the visitors were preparing to leave. saying that the nice young woman in a blue dress had done a lovely job of conducting the tour. Inez was stunned. Other than the tourists, she was the only one at the house that day. Curious, she took a few members of the group upstairs to Kathleen's room and pointed out a blue dress on display there. She asked if any of them recognized it. They all said they did, insisting that it was just like the one worn by the young woman who had given them the tour. Inez was convinced then that the ghost of her husband's Aunt Kathleen, who had lived in the house until her death in 1945, must have been the woman who ushered the guests through the place. There have been other reports of appearances by Kathleen outside the house near the garden gate. Some people also believe that the ghost of Kathleen's brother Frank makes his presence known every now and then, speaking in a loud voice in what was once his bedroom. But Inez O'Reilly believed that because of the way she acted, it was Caroline and no one else who drove the Australian women from her garden more than 40 years ago. As for the mysterious red light that the two women saw hovering over the gorge, several people think they have an explanation for the eerie experience too. On May 26, 1896, the original bridge spanning the gorge collapsed, sending dozens of people aboard a tram car plunging to a horrible death. The bodies of 55 men, women, and children were recovered. But it was assumed that the death toll was even higher. Those have seen the red light hovering above the waterway or water say it's the glow of a lantern carried by a spirit still looking for a loved one lost in the collapse. Obviously, the Australians had no idea when they rolled out their sleeping bags that their chosen campsite was rumored to be one of the most haunted locations in Victoria. If they had, that was the last place they would have chosen to spend their first night in the city, even if the price was right and the view breathtaking. Notes from nowhere, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Churches are seen as places of refuge, offering a peace and comfort to all who enter, but the sudden arrival of a mysterious presence in a church can disturb its peace and trouble the souls of those present. Such an event took place at St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Winnipeg more than 50 years ago. The cathedral stands across the street from St. John's Park, near the Redwood Avenue Bridge spanning the Red River. In 1817, Lord Selkirk set aside the land on which it was built for a church and a school to be used by the area's first European settlers. The Red River colonists, in 1822, a small mission church was constructed on part of what is now the cemetery. In 1833, a new larger church was built where the current cathedral now stands, and a third one was erected in 1862. The existing church was built in 1926, using much of the stone from the previous two structures. In 1927, a classic Casavant pipe organ was installed in the new church. 36 years later, that fine musical instrument would be the source of a very mysterious disturbance in the history-rich house of worship. In December of 1953, a small group of parishioners gathered in the cathedral's chapel one Sunday afternoon to reflect on the meaning of Advent, a time when Christians prepare spiritually for the coming of Christmas. Reverend John Ogle Anderson, the rector or senior clergyman, was there, as was his assistant, a cursate named Reverend H.J. Skinner. Reverend Skinner had planned a very simple, informal service of scripture, reading, and prayer. But as he began his first reading, any plans for simplicity went right out the stained glass windows. Suddenly, a single flute-sounding organ note echoed through the building, then another note, and another. No harmony was added, just single notes played slowly, one by one, with the flute stop pulled out. The dozen or so parishioners present that afternoon were surprised to hear the strange melody interrupt the rector's reading. The organist wasn't known for making mistakes like that. But the rector and the dean were even more astonished. The organist wasn't there. And from where he was sitting in the chapel, Reverend Anderson could see that no one else was sitting in front of the instrument's two-tiered keyboard. The haunting sounds continued to resonate throughout the cathedral for several minutes that afternoon. The next day, the rector called in a technician who regularly serviced the organ, but the man could see nothing wrong with it. What's more, he found that all the stops, including the flute stop, were pushed in, preventing any wind from entering the pipes to make the sound. The organ had not been touched after the disturbingly strange episode, and set like that. It shouldn't have been able to make any sound at all, so the technician couldn't come up with any earthly explanation. Neither could the rector or the curate, and the identity of the invisible organ player with the ghostly tune remains a mystery to this day. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking my channel, and I will see you on the next one.